Father, we bless you, we thank you, we love you. As we open your word, we want you to quicken your Holy Spirit, aliven your word, illumine it to us so that we may know you better, so that you may reveal yourself to us. Our series, as we've started, even our first Sunday, January 12th, our series has been this, Jesus according to John. And what we're doing is using the Gospel of John as sort of our main path, but then we're embracing, wrapping our arms around other things that the same John, the disciple that Jesus loved, the fisherman, the son of Zebedee, sons of thunder, brother of James, all the things, the elder, we're wrapping our arms around the other things that he said, and we're going to see a lot of that today because it's all relevant. And so we're really trying to draw near to this man. And besides Jesus himself, and maybe the Apostle Paul, I've always been, since I got saved, I've always been enamored with the Apostle John. I told you probably many times that when I got saved as a 19-year-old in college, the guy who shared the gospel with me, I asked him, what do I do now? What do I do now? And I just did everything he told me to do, and I said, where do I read in the Bible? He was like, well, don't start in the beginning. A lot of people start in the beginning. That's not maybe a great place. Start more towards the middle. Actually, the second half, way towards the second half. And I'm like, tell me where. And he's like, well, in New Testament. I'm like, what's that? Because I didn't really know much. He said, actually start in the Gospel of John. And that's where I started. That's where I started reading. The very first day that I was filled with the Spirit and saved, and my eyes were opened. And so ever since then, I've sort of been in love with this book and with the guy who wrote it, in a sense. And that was over 30 years ago. And so I can't wait to open it up for you today. We're going to finish chapter 2. Look at us making some progress. We're going to finish chapter 2 today in a thing that has some really familiar and interesting tones to it. I want to squeeze it maybe in a different direction than maybe you've squeezed this text before, that you've seen it before. Every time we open John, there's really going to be 4 questions, because these are the questions that John wants us to wrestle with, okay? One of them is, who is Jesus really, right? That's why he writes his whole gospel message. He wants people to understand that Jesus is the Messiah, and that by trusting him, believing in him, we'll find life in his name. So the first question is, who is Jesus? The second one is, what does he come to do in big picture? What does he exactly come to do? What is his mission, we could say? The third one is event-specific as we read this story. What is this story about? What does it say about his identity? What does it say about his mission? But what is this story about? And then finally, the most important one probably is, what are we to do with it? What's our place? What's our invitation? And so I want you to think about those 4 things: identity of Jesus, the mission of Jesus, the purpose of this specific text, and then what's your invitation in this? Because this is going to be one of the more unique stories of Jesus. It's not a healing. It's not a big teaching. It's one of the ones where we see a little side of Jesus that, frankly, some of us are a little uncomfortable with. And we're going to have to wrap our heads and hearts around that together. So it's in John chapter 2, starting in verse 12. Last week, we dug deep into water and wine in a unique way, and I hope if you were with us, if you weren't, it's available on our website and on YouTube. If you remember, one of my big hopes was that you never think about John 2 as Jesus changing water into wine ever again, because it's so much more than that. It's not just any old water, and it's not just any old wine. Jesus changes the water of ceremonial cleansing attached to the Mosaic law into the wine of messianic kingdom celebration, and he continues to do that. This is how he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is not just some luxury miracle of social embarrassment solution for a family friend. This is so richly symbolic that John chose that to be the first sign of all that Jesus did in a book of signs. No, we're going to pick up right as that ended in John chapter 2, verse 12. It'll be up on the screen. After this, he went down to Capernaum. He and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. We're just going to read the whole text, and then we'll walk back through it. Verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Then the Jews then said to him, what sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it took 46 years to build this temple, and you'll raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, during the feast, many believed in his name, observing signs which he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, was not entrusting himself to them, for he knew all men. And because he did not need anyone to testify concerning man, for he himself knew what was in man. There is a unique context here that's really important. So we'll go back to verse 12 and just get the geography. After this, in Cana, that's in the north, in Galilee, he went down to Capernaum. And so if you have ever been to Israel, some of you have been to Israel with me. Some of you, Lord willing, will go to Israel with me again one day. I really believe that probably starting next year, people are going now, and pastors are leading tours now, and I've been delayed a couple of times since all the things happened in October a couple years ago, and so it's obviously been very, very difficult to go. But Israel wants us to come, and it's relatively safe, but many of the sites have been closed. And so to charge you several $1,000s to take you over there and get you flights into Tel Aviv, and then not to be able to go to some of the sites would be quite frustrating. And so we're waiting and praying and hoping, and I really believe that in about a year from now, I bet you 100% of the sites, if not sooner, 100% of the sites will be open, and so hopefully we'll be able to go again. I want to go as many times as I can because it's one of my favorite places on the earth. If you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee, it's sort of like a clock. It's a small lake. It's called the Sea, but about 11 o'clock, maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock on the clock, this is where Capernaum is. It's uninhabited now. Capernaum probably means the village of Nahum, the prophet that we have in our Old Testament. And so the village of Nahum, Capernaum, it's uninhabited now. Tel Hum is there, and you can go and see the synagogue of Capernaum that Jesus taught in. You can walk on the stones that were placed on the stones that Jesus stood on. It's pretty amazing. It's one of my favorite spots. Peter's mother-in-law lived there, and we have the story in another gospel of Jesus raising up Peter's mother-in-law from a deathly sickness. And so Capernaum is there. This is the home base of Jesus's ministry, and he went there with his mother. We know her. She is never named in John's gospel. That's interesting. It's always just his mother. She's never called Mary in John's gospel, probably because, best we can tell, Mary Magdalene plays an important part in the end of John's gospel, and perhaps John doesn't want any confusion over which Mary he's talking about. But she is never named in this gospel. So his mother, his brothers, ? And his disciples, they stayed there a few days. His brothers. Matthew tells us the names of his 4 brothers, and he had at least 2 sisters because it's plural. So these would be the other children of Mary and Joseph, the half-brothers and sisters of Jesus, who was not a biological child of Joseph, right? Immaculate, divine, Holy Spirit conception of Mary, which is really important theologically. His brothers, would you remember their names? Some of them are a little shocking. James is the oldest one, we think. Joseph, probably named after his father. Simon, interesting, and Judas of all, right? It's a popular name back then. No one names anybody Judas anymore, right? We know why. And then we had at least 2 sisters. They're never named. And so right now the family is with them. Perhaps they moved to Capernaum. And then the next verse, 13, the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Even though it's south 85 miles, this is probably a 4 or 5 day or more journey. 85 miles south, but we go up because Galilee is lower in elevation and Jerusalem is up into the Judean mountains. So you're going south. We always say in Texas, at least I grew up in Texas, we go up to Dallas and we go down to Houston. It doesn't really matter about elevation here. But in biblical times, we're often talking about elevation. So we go up to Jerusalem. Passover is the context. Mention it twice, don't you know? Verse 13. And then again at the end, it was the Passover of the Jews. Passover is the context here. It's very important because in the time of Jesus, the city of Jerusalem probably had maybe 50,000 residents in all of the villages called the daughters of the city all around, maybe more. Josephus tells us that in some of the Passovers at the time, that 50, 60, 70,000 regular inhabitants of Jerusalem in the villages could swell to 2.5 million. So we are talking jam-packed, living multiple people in every room, on every housetop, family, very extended uncle of an uncle of an uncle. Can we stay with you during Passover? Yes, you can, because there is no room anywhere else. And imagine in the temple then, the clogged shoulder-to-shoulder activity. Not only for the day of Passover, which was one evening, long meal, right? That was day one, but then the 7-day feast of unleavened bread that came after that. So this is 7-8 days or more, travel on both ends. This is a long period with a lot of people in Jerusalem. And so Jesus chooses this often in the Gospel of John, Passover as moments for great ministry, okay? Does anybody think there's something odd about John's gospel starting with Jesus going into the temple and turning over tables, especially when you think about Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it happens at the end, the last week of Jesus' life. Because when he rides his donkey down from the Mount of Olives in the triumphal entry, he goes into the temple, and that's when he turns over the tables. This is Palm Sunday, not years before, at least it seems what John is saying. There's lots of thought about that. One of the thoughts is that John rearranged the things to put this up front. Another thought is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke rearranged the things to put it at the end. My personal thought, I've studied this a lot over the years. My personal thought is he actually did it twice. He actually did it in the beginning of his ministry when no one knew who he was. And they were so shocked, we see this conversation here, they were like, what? But since he didn't do it again, he didn't cause a stir again after that, they probably kind of backed off, the authorities, the Pharisees, the Jews. And then he did it again on Palm Sunday when he rides in that last week before his crucifixion. I think he probably did it twice. I think John chose to identify the former one, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they focus on that last week so much, identified the latter. But we don't know. It's not impossible, based on the arrangement, a thematic and theological arrangement, that some of them moved some of the things. But because John keeps such close account, chronology, I think that it actually happened twice. Are you worried about a second thing? Are you worried that Jesus kind of gets angry? Is that hard for you? I'm asking honestly, because there's an infection in the church. There's an infection in the world when it comes to Jesus. Some of the long-term affection in the church is we see the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, which is a phrase that just kind of irks me already, as two different gods, two different characters, two different sort of personality, so that the God of the Old Testament is angry and harsh and throws lightning bolts and kills people by the thousands. And then the God of the New Testament is Jesus, kind and loving and compassionate and welcoming to everyone. There are so many theological problems with what I just said, it's hard to even break down. There are no two different gods. God is just as compassionate in the Old Testament as he is in the New. And as we can tell in this, and I don't know if you've read Revelation 19, but God is just as just and wrathful in the New Testament as he is in the Old sometimes. Not two different gods. Not two different faces. Not a moody God and a not so moody God. This is not what we're talking about. And so that is false. The other infection in much of the world is to see Jesus as this welcoming person of all things. So Jesus just, hey, anybody, anything, anytime, I'm just going to put my stamp of approval and compassion and grace on it. And so Jesus is the most, I'm going to use the word a lot today, tolerant person we've ever seen. There are, of course, a lot of people who see Jesus as the most intolerant person that history has ever seen. But a lot of the world, Jesus is just a good teacher, a really, really good teacher. And there's a lot of problems with that theologically, a ton of problems, okay? First, because he taught that he was God. And if he's just a good teacher, that makes him a liar, which makes him the worst teacher ever. And so here is a moment that I want to, again, as I told you, I want to squeeze it in a different direction. I'm not going to try to explain away Jesus' anger, but I do want to look at it because it's fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me in several ways. I want to have you think not so much of the word anger, which I think is appropriate, but I'm not sure it's helpful for us sometimes because we see anger in God a lot. In Ephesians, Paul will say, in your anger, do not sin. So he's telling us in that phrase, and he's quoting the Old Testament, that it's possible to be angry and not sin. I'm not sure if I've ever done it. Maybe you have. But apparently it's possible because God is said to be angry at times. So we know it's possible. But instead of using that word anger, I want to not substitute it, I want to maybe connect it with, perhaps, a word that I think is maybe a little better. And if at the very least, it'll be kind of like a pry bar to get us in. And that's the word jealousy. I want you to consider the word jealousy. I want to read to you from St. Augustine, from perhaps one of the first autobiographies in history. It's called Just Confessions, written in the 5th century, very old, translated from Latin by a guy named Henry Chadwick. But here's a prayer that I've been trying to memorize, to be frank with you, because his language here is so fantastic. See if you can get what Augustine is saying. Here's his prayer. Who then are you, my God? Just listen. Maybe you could close your eyes and just listen. Here's a picture. It's not on the screen on purpose. Who are you then, my God? What, I ask, but God, who is the Lord? For who is the Lord but the Lord? And who is God but our God? Most high, utterly good, utterly powerful, most omnipotent, most merciful, and most just, deeply hidden, yet most intimately present, perfection of both beauty and strength, stable and incomprehensible, immutable and yet changing all things, never new, never old, making everything new and leading the proud to be old without their knowledge, always active, always at rest, gathering to yourself but not in need, supporting and filling and protecting, creating and nurturing and bringing to maturity, searching even though to you nothing is lacking. You love without burning. You are jealous in a way that is free of anxiety. You repent without the pain of regret. You are wrathful and remain tranquil. You will a change without any change in your design. You recover what you find, yet you've never lost. Never in need, you rejoice in your gains. You are never greedy, yet you require interest. We pay you more than you require so as to make you our debtor, yet who has anything which doesn't belong to you? You pay off debts, though owing nothing. You cancel debts and incur no loss. But in these words, what have I said, my God, my life, my holy sweetness? What has anyone achieved in words when he speaks about you? Isn't that good? Isn't that good? This is a very, very old saint trying to wrap his heart around this idea. what the scripture reveals is that he cancels debts, but he's not in loss. He seems to be always moving, but he's not stressed. He's never new, he's never old, he's new and old. All of this, I'm fascinated with the language. Did you notice the phrase, you're jealous in a way that's free from anxiety? It's translated from the Latin. It's probably better in Latin. But I like this idea of jealous because we immediately see the issue if you're familiar with your scriptures. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love is patient, love is kind. What is one thing that love is not? Jealous. There's a lot of things love is not, but love is not jealous. Okay. But if Jesus is expressing anger and jealousy, how can that be when love isn't jealous and God is love? Well, you look up jealous in the Old Testament, you're going to see it a ton. Exodus chapter 34, Moses is up on the mountain receiving the second tablets from God. After God proclaims his name and his character, he says, my name is jealous. For I want you to have no other gods before me. He names himself jealous. Okay. Stick with me now because we're beginning to crack open what Jesus reveals here in John chapter 2. If his name is jealous and he's jealous for us, we trust just for the our conversation here because he's God, that's a good thing, not a sinful thing. He's not jealous in a way that we would see like a jealous boyfriend in college or a jealous friend who's competing with someone for a spot on the basketball team. This is obviously not the kind of jealous that God is, the kind of jealousy that he experiences, but he sure seems to experience it through all of the prophets. Zechariah, he says, I am so jealous for my name and for my people. Over and over and over again in the prophets. Could it be that Jesus, when he comes into this crowded marketplace in the temple, is actually jealous? Yes, it's anger as well, I imagine, but Jesus' holy love and divine jealousy obviously does not like certain things. And you would call that rather intolerant, wouldn't you? But see, there's a connection to all of those things. And here's where I want you to zero in, because if you can understand this, you can understand what I have to offer you today by the Spirit of God. And that is that there's a connection between love and jealousy and zeal, what we see in this text, that is really an invitation for you and I. And it has to do with being intolerant. Being intolerant. Let me explain it to you. How could a good father training and leading his children not be rightly intolerant when his kids begin to develop certain bad habits or begin to gather certain terrible friends or begin to walk down a certain road? A tolerant father in that situation would go, hey man, yeah, we can work with all of that. It's okay. It's okay. Compassion and grace and mercy and yeah. It's all good. It's all good. No. That's not a good father. That's not what a good father would do. That's not what our Father in heaven does to us. No, it's actually intolerant for him to come in and say, hey, wait a second. No, that's not how we do things. That's not how I trained you. That's not what I pray for you. That's not what I want for you. Those friends are bad. That habit is bad. This will take your life away. That's a good father, right? What about a friend? What about a friend who is not just an acquaintance, not just that workmate? You're like, hey, cool, you're good, I'm good, we're always good, okay. But not the friend that trusts and that is trusting of someone else. What about a friend, maybe you've been in this situation, you see your friend going down a road that leads to death and destruction. What does a good friend do? A good friend just goes, man, whatever you choose, I'm right here beside you. I got your back, ride or die. That's me, right? No, that's not a good friend, actually. That's a terrible friend. I'm going to hold your hand while you fall off a cliff. That's a terrible friend. No, a good friend would be rather intolerant to say, hey, and they would do it in a certain way, put your arm around you and say, hey, I don't know if you can see it, but I can see it. You are headed to darkness and shadow, and I feel it my responsibility as a friend to not just give you a blanket pardon of all that, but because I love you, to say this is bad and wrong and it's going in the wrong direction. What about a wife whose husband has wandering eyes or wandering feet? Is it a good wife when she says, oh yeah, I accept my man for who he is. And I know he's out and about and he stays out at the bar and he does all these other things and he's got inappropriate relationships at work and down the street or whatever. But tolerance. What? Is that a good wife? Of course not. No, that's ludicrous. That's evil and wrong. A good wife would go with some jealousy, right? Put your arm around your man and go, hey, that has nothing to do with the vows that we made to each other. This is destroying good relationship and health and peace and family. And I'm not going to stand for it, nor should they. There are situations in our life and relationships where actually Jesus' actions should be our actions. And it's going to look like intolerance. Matthew Barrett says it this way. We'll put it up on the screen in the end and then we'll work this out. Intolerant love is the type of jealousy we cannot live without. How about that? Intolerant love is the kind of jealousy we cannot live without. This is the jealousy that God shows when we bow down to an idol, when we feed ourselves with sinful things. He says, I am jealous for you because I know that leads to your destruction. I would not be a good God, a good father, if I just blanket pardoned you with compassion and mercy. No. And so here, hold on to that when we come to Jesus. He found in the temple, verse 14, those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and money changers at their table, and he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. I looked up art on this. It was like ubiquitous. It was everywhere. A lot of ancient, Renaissance, and common modern contemporary artists love this scene because it's so unique to Jesus. And so I couldn't even find one to show you. One that I liked anyway, because there's this picture of Jesus in this throng with whips, all different angles. You've probably seen many of them. There's some very famous. To those who were selling the doves, he said, take these things away. Stop making my Father's house an emporium in Greek. An emporium. A marketplace. A marketplace. Friends, beware the business of religion. Beware. It is far afield from the simple, pure devotion of worship to God. The business of religion. Beware. It's not a jump off a cliff, as many, many men and women have discovered. It seems to be a slippery, slight slope. You get there and you don't even know it. How did I get here? And here we are. We're doing this thing for the decimal points to be in the right place. And I don't understand it. People who write songs out of a desire to be a David in the wilderness by themselves end up years later trying to figure out how to manipulate people with lyrics and sell it. Pastors, men and women who are passionate about experiencing God and then sharing that with others and then speaking the gospel unadulterated and simple, find that the spotlight is a bit attractive. If I can just get my stage a little bigger and a little bigger At some point, there may be a paycheck at the end of that. And if I can get that be a little bigger, see, that has an effect on what you say on the stage. Beware the business of religion. It is far afield from the simple, pure worship of God. Here's Jesus with a broken and, yes, jealous, intolerant heart, coming into a place where his Father said, my name will dwell. And all he sees is money making and interest charging and exchanging this for that. And he is rightfully angry, righteously angry. Stop making my Father's house an emporium. Take these things away. And can you imagine what his disciples, his mother and brother, I see Mary, I imagine Jesus is probably at least in his late 20s, early 30s, something like that, if our dating is correct, probably in his early 30s, which means maybe some of his brothers and sisters, I don't know, are in their early 30s, late 20s, something like that. If they're young, I always see Mary doing the mom thing as Jesus goes up to the table and throws it over. Mary does this with all the siblings, like, oh my God, what is Jesus doing? You know, like doing the seatbelt in the car thing. No, don't go closer. And she's freaking out because she doesn't see it coming. His disciples don't see it coming. Nobody sees it coming. But when you understand God's heart, when you understand the purpose and beauty of that place that he was, it's difficult to not feel what Jesus felt. It's difficult. So let's look, because the Lord just this week revealed something to me in his word that I've never seen before. And it just took the breath out of me. It took the breath out of me because of how beautiful it is. And I've read and even taught this passage so many times. His disciples, verse 17, remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. This is from Psalm 69. We'll put that on the screen, Glenn, if we have it. Psalm 69 later on, verses 6 through 9. When... there's some words at the beginning. Sorry. May those who wait for you not be ashamed through me, O Lord God of hosts. May those who seek you not be dishonored through me, O God of Israel. Because for your sake I have borne reproach. Dishonor has covered my face. I've become estranged from my brothers. Interesting. An alien to my mother's son. And for zeal for your house has consumed me. And the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. This is what the disciples remember later. Not in the moment. They're freaking out in the moment going, oh, we've not seen this part of Jesus. We didn't expect that. And they remember this later, Psalm 69. Verse 18, then the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for your authority for doing these things? And Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Do you remember in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they're doing the mock trial at the end of Jesus' life? And they're gathering him up. Remember what some of the eyewitnesses said? Some guy comes up and says, I'll tell you what he said. I'm thinking of the Passion of the Christ now because he's an ugly dude when he comes up. I'll tell you what he said. Remember, he said he would destroy the temple and raise it up in 3 days. Is that what Jesus said? No. He didn't say I. He said you, the Jews, you. That's the Greek subject of the word destroy. You destroy this temple and I'll raise it up in 3 days. He never said I would. He never was threatening. The Jews said, it took 46 years to build this place and you're going to raise it up in 3 days. The first tabernacle was probably built somewhere around 1445 BC. If the Exodus was in 1446, as many people explain and date that, at the base of Mount Sinai, that means that it was the tabernacle, this portable thing, once it came through the 40 years of wandering and then landed in Canaan, settled in Shiloh, which where I've been to, where the tabernacle was set up. And again, Lord willing, we'll go there one day. For 500 years, before David and Solomon came along, and then Solomon built the temple a long time, many, many years, dedicated it around 960 BC. That temple was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians and then rebuilt under Zerubbabel, which is in the family of David, Shealtiel, and Haggai, and Zechariah, and the ministry of those prophets around 520 BC. The second temple was shabby compared to Solomon's. And then Herod the Great comes along 500 years later, and he wants to build trust with the Jews. He wants to get noticed by the Romans, and he is a paranoid, kind of schizophrenic, murdering thief, like he's a crazy dude, but he's really good at building stuff, and so he works it out with the Jews to renovate the temple, to kind of get on their good side. And it started in 20 BC. And this is probably around 30 AD, obviously a little before that. And so 46 years of renovation. It actually wasn't completed until 63, 30 years after Jesus died, and then Titus and the Romans came in and destroyed it in 70. It was complete for 7 years after being worked on for about 83 years. They said, this whole place? Yeah, but then he said, no. He was speaking of the temple of his body. Now watch this. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scriptures and the word which he had spoken. And then we have this thing at the end. Many people believed in him, the signs he was doing at the Passover, but he did not entrust them. Same verb. They believed in him. He did not entrust. But believe, pistuo. They believed in him. He did not believe, did not entrust himself to them. It wasn't his timing. Doesn't mean that their faith was false or spurious or shallow or non-salvific. I don't think there's such a thing as false faith in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of John. When somebody has faith in Jesus, that's the whole point of writing the Gospel. And he wouldn't confuse us, wouldn't confuse them. They believed in Jesus. And that was salvation. But he said, this is not the time for me. It's not my hour. And so he knew what was in man. They would try to make him and throw him up into the throne of King Herod. He's like, that's not my path. But here's what the Lord revealed to me. We somehow have to enter into this idea of jealous love that expresses itself in intolerance, but we have to do it well, right? We have to do it right. We have to do it as God would do it, as Jesus would do it. And so the words of John are going to help us. John in 1 John and then Revelation, and then I'm going to share with you what Jesus shared with me, I think. John wrote his first epistle, 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. You would hear him say this: do not love the world or the things in the world. If anybody loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. You recognize this passage. Many of you remember it. For all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, boastful pride of life, it's from the Father. It's not from the world. The world's passing away and its lust. The one who abides, the one who does the will of God abides forever, lives forever. He's like, hey, there's some things in this world that are not right, and you shouldn't tolerate those things. You shouldn't tolerate those things. He doesn't use the word tolerate here, but he will. I'll show you. Verse 18, children, it's the last hour, and just as you've heard that the Antichrist is coming, I say many Antichrists have already appeared. I've not written to you because you don't know the truth, but because you do know it. I'm not writing to you for any other reason, but he who denies this, who denies that Jesus is the Christ, who denies that the Son is not at one with the Father, that doesn't confess that the Father is also with the Son, who denies all of these things, those are things we can't tolerate. And I'm writing to you, verse 26, concerning those who are going to try to deceive you. Chapter 4, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God, because many false prophets have gone into the world. This you know, the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Every spirit that does not, this is the spirit of the Antichrist. He says there are things that we tolerate and there are things that we don't tolerate. Now, okay, pause for just a second. Jesus, who goes and turns in the tables of the temple, he also welcomed the prostitute, didn't he? And the tax collector and the sinner. The woman caught in adultery. Okay, yes. But he also has this strange relationship, almost always negative, with the Pharisees, the one who should know things, who seem to be like his nemesis in the gospel. I hope you're tracking with me because it's going to come together here in just a second. What we see in Jesus is this way that we should walk. There are things by which we share and embrace compassionately. The sin of the prostitute and the woman caught in adultery and the blind demoniac and this guy and that guy. Jesus welcomes him, eats with them, touches the leper. But then when people, institutions, men or women, set themselves up against the truth of who God is, against the gospel, against what the scriptures reveal about him, against life, against things like marriage, then all of a sudden Jesus draws a line. And he says, no, I'm not going to cross that line. I'm going to stay here. You can call me intolerant if you want. Because love, like we said, this jealous love, this divine jealousy is the kind of love that we need. We can't live without. That's a good friend, a good father, a good wife. So is God. Now here's what he showed me in the book of Revelation. You know the 7 churches? This is John writing also. John wrote the gospel first. He wrote his apostles in between, as best we can tell. And he wrote Revelation at the end. The 7 churches. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. The 7 churches that he's writing to in the first few chapters. There are some of these churches that do not get a well done. Some of them do. Let's look at 4 and what he says. I did a deep study of this, and a lot of what he says is bad about the churches is actually what they tolerate. Watch. Revelation 2, to the angel of the church of Ephesus, I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men. And you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not. And you found them to be false. And you have perseverance and have endured for my name's sake and have not grown weary. Well done, Ephesus. Next verse, but you've lost and left your first love. But well done now. Why? Because you do not tolerate evil men and false prophets. The next out of order is along with him. Philadelphia, I know your deeds. Behold, I've put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power and have kept my word and have not denied my name. Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet and make them know that I have loved you. What he's saying is you have not given in to these false teachers. Well done, Philadelphia. Now watch the 2 negative ones, the harsher ones. First is Pergamum. But I have a few things against you, Pergamum, because you have there some who hold the teaching of Balaam and who kept teaching Balak, is in the Old Testament, and put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols, to commit acts of immorality. So you also have some who in the same way hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. That's a whole nother story. All we know here is it's bad. And he's saying, you tolerate these people. In your church, that's a bad thing. I'm not happy with you. Sardis is the last one. Nope, Thyatira. I know your deeds and your love and faith and service and perseverance, and that your deeds of late are greater than at first, but I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray so that they commit acts of immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. How do we embody Jesus? Remember I told you those 4 questions? Who is Jesus? Identity. What does he come to do? What is his mission? What is this event about? The purpose of this? And what are we to do? What is our invitation? And how do we embody Jesus in this moment of turning tables over in the temple? Without going and actually turning tables over at our office and losing our job, although maybe I know many people who have actually said to their boss, in times, and God bless you for doing that if that's been your story, when the boss comes in and says, close the door, and you close the door, and he asks you and commands you to do something that's immoral and illegal. Many men and women that I've known have said, I am not doing that. And they said, but if you don't, I'll fire you. And they say, fire me. No severance. Your family will be gone. I don't care. Not doing that. It's immoral and illegal. I'm not doing that. How do we embody Jesus that has compassion and grace and welcomes, but then also can display this divine sense of jealousy that is righteous and holy at times? It's difficult. I would suggest to you three things. A careful walk, and I mean careful by full of care, a careful walk in our life to follow along with what Jesus by his Spirit says to the churches. I know your deeds. A careful walk. Second, I would say a careful discernment, asking God to make plain the things that are in front of me. And finally, and I'll explain this, I would say a careful jealousy, a careful commitment, this devotion to a relationship that is so important that in the face of a challenge to that relationship, I'm going to fight for it because it's right. Here's what the Lord revealed to me. It's wild. Because I can't get out of my mind this very odd. I'll just be frank with you. It's odd for me. It's not difficult. It's not difficult. It's just odd for me. I would say this. It's distasteful for me to see Jesus with a whip in his hand. It's not odd. It's not difficult. It's just distasteful. Jesus with a whip. I don't get the sense in the text, all of the commentators and commentaries I've read, and lots of them, don't say that he's whipping people. He's whipping those animals and getting them out of the temple. He doesn't seem to be harsh to humans. He turns the tables over. He doesn't punch the money changers. Why is he doing this? Because he is zealous and jealous for what should be happening in this place, worship. Here's the two things. That zeal for your house has consumed me. That word consume in Hebrew and in Greek means to utterly destroy, to kill. Zeal for your house has destroyed me. And then he says, I'll give you the sign of my authority. Destroy this temple and I'll raise it up. Here's the picture. This shocking reversal. When Jesus goes to the cross, he dies for the sin that happened in the temple on that day. What is even more? The whip that he held, he took it on his back. He took it on his back. And he said, I hate what is happening in this place. I am jealous for my Father's house. Zeal has destroyed me and will destroy me. And this body will be the payment. I will take the lash to make this place new. I will take the lash to free you from the very sin that I'm jealous over. And so it is right and good when we see a divine love and jealousy in the person of Jesus. Not because simply it's right for him and holy for his character and for ours, but also because he took the brunt of the whip. He finished the story. He didn't leave us at the end. He met us there and said, I'll take all of this too. I'll take all of this too. The big idea that I have to share for you is simple, and then we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. Only when properly partnered with godly jealousy and zeal can love truly be God-like love. And that's hard. It's hard to walk out. Only when partnered with this sense of godly jealousy. I would say a sense of divine intolerance towards truth, towards the gospel. I don't have to tell you that there are authors and speakers and pastors and churches and movements who have gutted the gospel, who have gutted Jesus of all real true meaning. And they're expanding in the culture. We must draw a line and say, you're my friend. I love you. I want to be there, but I'm not crossing this line. I cannot go there. I cannot say or agree with what you're agreeing to. When it comes to life, when life begins, how life is treated after it begins, from the beginning to the very end, marriage, gender, sex, the way that our relationships work in the workplace and at home, all of those things, I think there are many opportunities for us to embody Jesus in this place and say, with compassion and love, I'm going to be intolerant and draw a line. With a divine jealousy, partnered with a zeal, because I want my love of you and my love of God to be a godlike love. And that means a commitment to what's right and true. And sometimes I have to flip over some tables. I'm not asking you to go and flip over tables. I'm definitely not asking you to go break down doors, anything like that. Please don't misunderstand. Please don't misunderstand. Please, please. But there are times when we have to embody Jesus in this way that I think are going to be very, very difficult for us. Perhaps our church, perhaps me, perhaps in this culture. And I pray very simply that we would hold on to this text and this idea when those opportunities come, so that we can stand in the resolve of Jesus in those days and in those moments, however small or large they are, and say, no, I will not be moved. I will not be moved from this place.